The muddy waters of the Missouri River lapped against the worn wooden docks of Abilene as Sarah Johnson stared out her bedroom window at the endless parade of steamboats and barges. The judge's daughter had always found solace in watching the river traffic, but today the sight brought her no comfort. Her father's latest gambling debt weighed heavily on her mind. She'd discovered the promissory note in his study, bearing an astronomical sum owed to the notorious Wilson Trading Company. Judge Thomas Johnson had once been the most respected man in Abilene, dispensing justice with wisdom and fairness from his Riverside courthouse. But the death of Sarah's mother 3 years ago had broken something in him, driving him to seek refuge in whiskey and cards. Now his addiction threatened to destroy not just himself, but everything their family had built in this bustling river town. Sarah smoothed her dark blue dress and touched the silver locket at her throat, her mother's final gift. At 22, she had become the de facto lady of the house, managing their dwindling finances and trying desperately to maintain appearances. But even she couldn't hide the truth forever. The Wilson brothers were dangerous men who controlled much of the river trade between St. Louis and Kansas City. They would collect their due, one way or another. The sound of horses' hooves on packed earth drew her attention to the street below. A group of rough-looking men had gathered outside the courthouse, led by James Wilson himself, a corpulent figure in an expensive suit who carried himself with the arrogant air of someone used to getting his way. Sarah's heart began to race as she watched them dismount and stride purposefully toward the building's entrance. Inside his chambers, Judge Johnson sat slumped at his desk, an empty whiskey bottle beside him. His once commanding presence had deteriorated into that of a broken man, his silver hair unkempt and his clothes wrinkled. When the door burst open, he barely lifted his bloodshot eyes to acknowledge Wilson and his men. Sarah, who had rushed downstairs after them, pressed herself against the wall outside, straining to hear their conversation. "Time's up, Judge," Wilson's oily voice carried through the doorway. "You've had 3 months to make good on your marker. Now we'll be collecting our due, one way or another." The threat in his words was unmistakable. Sarah heard her father's chair scrape against the floor as he stumbled to his feet, his voice trembling as he begged for more time. In the shadows of a nearby alley, a figure watched the scene unfold with keen interest. Samuel Davis kept his scarred face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed black hat, his right hand resting casually on the pearl-handled revolver at his hip. 5 years ago, he'd been the youngest law partner in the territory before the Wilson gang had left him for dead in a burning warehouse. Now he'd returned to Abilene with revenge in his heart and the skills of a hardened bounty hunter. The bitter tang of wood smoke drifted across the river as Samuel observed Wilson's men departing the courthouse. The judge's daughter emerged shortly after, her face pale but composed as she hurried toward the town's telegraph office. Samuel had been tracking the Wilson gang's operations for months, gathering evidence of their corruption and brutality. But seeing Sarah, who'd been like a sister to him years ago, brought all the old memories flooding back. That evening, as darkness settled over Abilene, Samuel made his way to the Silver Dollar Saloon, where he knew Wilson conducted much of his business. The scarred bounty hunter ordered whiskey and settled into a dark corner, watching as the crime lord held court among his associates. The pieces of his plan were falling into place, but time was running out. He could sense that Wilson was preparing to move against the judge, and Sarah would likely be caught in the crossfire. As Samuel nursed his drink, Elizabeth Miller, the saloon's owner and Wilson's reluctant business partner, approached his table. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of his scarred face, but she maintained her composure. "You're new in town," she said softly, setting down a fresh bottle. "Word of advice, whatever brought you here, let it go. This isn't a place for heroes anymore." Samuel smiled grimly, knowing she had no idea how deep his connection to Abilene truly ran. Elizabeth's warning hung in the air as Samuel watched her weave back through the crowded saloon, her dark skirts brushing against the sawdust-covered floor. The Silver Dollar's patrons grew rowdier as night deepened, but Samuel remained focused on Wilson's table, where the crime lord was now deep in conversation with a weather-beaten man in a marshal's badge. The sight made his stomach turn. Another lawman in Wilson's pocket, just like the others who'd looked the other way when the syndicate burned down his law office 5 years ago. Through the haze of tobacco smoke, Samuel caught glimpses of the Kansas River through the saloon's windows, its dark waters reflecting the lamplight from Abilene's waterfront. The river had brought prosperity to the town, But it had also carried in men like Wilson, who saw opportunity in corrupting everything they touched. The same river that had nearly claimed Samuel's life the night of the fire, when he'd dragged himself from its depths miles downstream, unrecognizable and presumed dead. A burst of raucous laughter drew his attention back to Wilson's table. The crime lord was now speaking with a well-dressed man Samuel recognized as Thomas Sterling, one of Judge William Harrison's closest friends. The sight confirmed his suspicions. Wilson was using the judge's inner circle to tighten the noose around him. Samuel's fingers traced the familiar pattern of scars along his jaw as he recalled the judge's daughter Sarah, barely more than a child when he'd last seen her. Now she was the key to Wilson's plan to destroy her father. The saloon's piano player struck up a lively tune as more riverboat crews filtered in from the docks. Samuel used the commotion to move closer to Wilson's table, settling at the bar where he could better hear their conversation. Elizabeth shot him a warning glance as she served drinks, but he ignored it. The fragments of discussion that reached his ears confirmed his worst fears. Wilson was calling in the judge's gambling markers tomorrow. Samuel knew what that meant for Sarah. Outside, a steam whistle echoed across the water as another riverboat docked. The sound reminded Samuel of his own journey back to Abilene, following the river's course from Fort Worth, where he'd first picked up Wilson's trail. The crime syndicate had grown in his absence, spreading like poison along the waterways, but they'd made a mistake returning to Abilene. This was where it had all started, and this was where Samuel would end it. Rising from his seat, Samuel left a coin on the bar and made his way to the door. He had preparations to make before tomorrow. Elizabeth caught his eye as he passed, and this time he gave her a slight nod. She might be Wilson's unwilling partner, but Samuel had seen how she'd tried to warn him. Perhaps she could be useful when the time came. For now, though, he needed to get word to Sarah before Wilson's men made their move. The night air carried the scent of river water and coal smoke as Samuel emerged onto the boardwalk. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog barked, and the sound of horses' hooves echoed from the direction of the livery. Samuel pulled his coat closer against the spring chill and headed toward the better part of town where the judge's house stood. He would need to be careful. Wilson surely had men watching the place, but he couldn't wait any longer. Sarah needed to know the truth about her father's debts, about Wilson's plans, and about the man he'd once been before the fire took everything but his need for justice. The moon cast long shadows across Abilene's streets as Samuel made his way through the sleeping town. In the distance, the Kansas River continued its eternal journey eastward, carrying its burden of commerce and secrets. Tomorrow would bring either salvation or destruction, but tonight the river's whispers reminded Samuel of everything he'd lost, and everything he'd come back to reclaim. Samuel paused in the shadow of an elm tree as two of Wilson's men crossed Main Street ahead, their spurs catching moonlight. He recognized James, the younger of the pair, a former deputy who'd fallen under Wilson's influence. The other was Thomas, a hired gun from Fort Worth with dead eyes and quick hands. Samuel touched the rough scar tissue along his jaw, remembering the night the courthouse burned, and waited for them to pass. The two-story home where Judge William Harrison lived stood like a fading monument to better days, its white paint peeling and shutters hanging askew. Samuel noted the empty hitching post where the judge's mare should have been. A bad sign. Either William was out late again, likely losing more money at Wilson's tables, or something worse had already happened. Moving between patches of shadow, Samuel worked his way around to the kitchen door, where Sarah used to leave him coffee during long nights reviewing cases. The memory of those evenings, before Wilson's syndicate tightened its grip on Abilene's throat, made his chest ache. He tested the handle and found it unlocked, another warning sign that raised the hair on his neck. Inside, moonlight filtering through lace curtains revealed a scene of quiet disorder. Drawers stood half open, their contents hastily rifled. A chair lay overturned near the stove, and the air held traces of Sarah's lavender water mixed with something else. Fear. Samuel drew his Colt, moving carefully across creaking floorboards toward the parlor. A figure stirred in the darkness. Small, feminine, frightened. "Sarah," he whispered, keeping his voice low. "It's Samuel. You remember me from before the fire?" There was a sharp intake of breath. Then Sarah Harrison stepped into a shaft of moonlight, her face pale but composed. She'd grown from the young woman he remembered into something harder, like river stones polished smooth by troubled waters. They said you were dead, she whispered back, eyes wide. Father identified your body himself after the fire. The muddy waters of the Missouri River lapped against the worn wooden docks of Fort Worth as Sarah Johnson made her way through the early morning fog. Her silk dress, once pristine and befitting a judge's daughter, now bore the grime of 3 days in captivity at the Thompson Brothers Riverboat Gambling Hall. The bruises on her wrists from the rope bindings had barely begun to fade, constant reminders of how her father's corruption had led to her being traded like cattle to cover his mounting debts. A tall figure emerged from the mist ahead, the scarred side of his face catching the dim light. Jake Miller's burns twisted across his features like a map of all the dark secrets he'd uncovered since the fire that should have killed him 2 years ago. Sarah had recognized him instantly when he'd appeared in her doorway the night before, though he was supposed to be dead. Her father's former deputy and law partner, now transformed into something harder and more dangerous. The Thompson outfit is moving their operation downriver to Silver City, Jake said, his voice rough from the smoke damage. Your father's been taking their bribes for years, using his position as judge to protect their gambling racket. But selling you to them, that was his final mistake. He adjusted the rifle slung across his back, scanning the shoreline with eyes that never seemed to rest. Samuel Thompson's riverboat empire had grown like a cancer along the Missouri, corrupting lawmen and politicians from Abilene to Fort Worth. But few knew the true scope of their operation. The forced labor camps hidden in remote river bends, the disappeared witnesses, the burned homesteads. Jake had spent 2 years gathering evidence, building a case that would bring it all crashing down. Sarah's situation had forced his hand sooner than planned. William Davis, the Thompson brothers' enforcer, had been trailing them since their escape. Sarah could feel his presence like a shadow at their backs as Jake led her through the maze of warehouses and lumber yards. Davis had been her father's drinking companion, always watching her with those cold eyes. Now she understood why. He'd been sizing her up like merchandise, knowing she would eventually be collected as payment. There's a marshal I trust in Tombstone, Jake explained as they took shelter in an abandoned river station. James Wilson. He's been building his own case against the Thompsons, documenting how deep the corruption goes. But we need proof of your father's direct involvement. Documents, ledgers, anything that shows the connection. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled a small leather diary from her boot. Like this? The diary had belonged to her father's clerk, Thomas Miller, before he'd been found floating face down in the river last month. Sarah had stolen it from her father's study the night before Davis came for her, though she hadn't understood its significance then. Now, as Jake carefully turned the water-stained pages, she saw his eyes widen at the detailed records of bribes, threats, and arrangements spanning years. Elizabeth Thompson, the youngest of the brothers, ran the legitimate side of the family business, the trading companies and shipping contracts that gave their criminal enterprise its cover. She had always been kind to Sarah at social functions, had even given her a job keeping books for the River Trade Office. Now Sarah wondered how many of those innocent-looking ledger entries had hidden darker transactions. A gunshot cracked through the morning air, splintering the wooden wall inches from Sarah's head. Jake threw her behind a stack of crates as more bullets followed. William Davis, he growled, returning fire through a broken window. And he's not alone. Sarah could hear boots on the boardwalk outside, men taking positions to surround them. She clutched the diary to her chest, knowing it might be their only chance to expose the truth. The firefight that followed would later be described by witnesses as one of the bloodiest in Fort Worth's history. Jake Miller's tactical experience showed in every move as he systematically eliminated the Thompson men, using the river station's layout to his advantage. Sarah proved her own worth, managing to slip out through a back window and circle around to flank Davis himself, landing a killing blow with an iron crowbar she'd found. In the aftermath, as lawmen finally began arriving, Sarah stood beside Jake on the blood-stained boardwalk. "My father will send more men," she said quietly, "and the Thompsons won't stop until we're dead." Jake nodded, reloading his rifle with mechanical precision. "Then we'll need to strike first. Your father's not the only corrupt judge in their pocket. This goes deeper than anyone suspects. Are you ready for what comes next?" Sarah looked out over the river, watching the morning sun burn away the last wisps of fog. She thought of all the other girls like her, sold to cover debts or silence witnesses. She thought of Thomas Miller's body in the river, of Jake's scarred face, of her father's practiced lies. Her voice was steady when she answered, "I'm ready to burn it all down." The journey downriver to Fort Worth took 3 days, with Jake and Sarah traveling under cover of darkness and hiding during daylight hours. They'd commandeered a small fishing skiff, its weathered planks barely keeping the muddy water at bay. Jake spent the quiet hours teaching Sarah to handle his spare revolver, watching as she developed the same steady hands he remembered her father having before greed consumed him. Between shooting lessons, Jake revealed more about the network of corruption that had nearly destroyed both their lives. The Thompsons had started small in Abilene, buying off local lawmen to protect their gambling operations. But they'd grown bold, eventually securing judges across 3 territories. Sarah's father wasn't their first puppet in a black robe, but he'd proven especially useful given his reputation for integrity. In Fort Worth, they found unlikely allies in the form of Mary and Elizabeth, 2 former working girls who'd escaped the Thompsons' brothels and established a legitimate boarding house near the docks. The sisters' establishment served as a sanctuary for others fleeing similar circumstances, though few survived long enough to reach it. Their network of informants proved invaluable, providing Jake with details of upcoming shipments and payoff schedules. Sarah took to life at the boarding house with surprising adaptability, her privileged upbringing giving way to practical skills. She learned to tend bar, keeping her ears open while serving drinks to rivermen who'd had too much whiskey. More than once, her quick thinking and newly developed shooting skills helped thwart attempts by Thompson men to infiltrate the sanctuary. Word reached them through Elizabeth's contacts that William Thompson himself was planning a rare visit to Fort Worth, supposedly to oversee a major expansion of their operation. Jake recognized the opportunity, but also the risk. Thompson never traveled without at least a dozen hardened gunmen, and he'd surely heard by now about the failed attempt to silence Sarah. The pieces began falling into place when Catherine, a scared young woman barely 17, stumbled into the boarding house one rain-soaked evening. She'd overheard details of Thompson's planned meeting with 3 territorial judges, including Sarah's father, at a remote hunting lodge upriver. The gathering would cement their control over the entire river corridor from Silver City to Tombstone. Jake spent long nights studying maps and planning approaches, his scarred face illuminated by lamplight as Sarah watched him work. She recognized the same methodical focus she'd seen in him during their escape, but now tempered with cold calculation. "Thompson will be expecting trouble," she said one evening. "He'll have the lodge fortified, probably 24 men at least." "That's why we won't hit the lodge," Jake replied, tracing a finger along the river's course. "They'll be bringing the judges in by steamboat. It's the only way to reach that location this time of year." The river narrows through Miller's Gorge with high cliffs on both sides. Perfect place for an ambush. His eyes met Sarah's. "But we'll need help. More than Mary and Elizabeth can provide." Sarah considered this, then smiled grimly. "I know where we can find it. Remember James Cooper, Father's former deputy who disappeared last year after asking too many questions? He didn't disappear. He's been gathering evidence, building a case. Last I heard, he had a camp of like-minded men up near Silver City." Jake nodded slowly, memories stirring of the young deputy who'd once helped him investigate the fire that should have killed him. "If Cooper's still the same man I knew, he won't be able to resist a chance to bring down 3 corrupt judges at once. But reaching him means crossing Thompson territory with a price on our heads." "Then we'd better start planning," Sarah said, pulling up a chair, "because I'm not letting them destroy any more lives." She spread out a fresh map, weighing down the corners with her revolver and 3 empty glasses. The lamp flickered, casting their shadows large against the boarding house walls as they began plotting a course through hostile territory. In the common room below, Mary and Elizabeth continued their nightly routine of serving drinks and gathering intelligence, while Catherine huddled in a corner, still shaking from her ordeal, but finding strength in the company of survivors. Outside, the river rolled on, its dark waters carrying secrets and possibilities toward an approaching dawn. The muddy waters of the Missouri River churned beneath the Abilene Riverboat Casino, as Sarah Wilson stared numbly at the gilded mirrors lining the gambling hall. Her father, Judge Thomas Wilson, had lost everything: their home, his reputation, and now his own daughter. The syndicate's enforcer, William Thompson, stood behind her chair with a proprietary hand on her shoulder, his gold rings glinting in the gaslight as he reminded her of her father's unpaid debts. Sarah had watched helplessly as her father's gambling addiction spiraled over the past year, his position as circuit judge giving him access to dirty money from the river syndicates. Now she was being traded like cattle to work in Catherine Miller's notorious riverboat brothel, The madam's painted smile did nothing to mask the cruelty in her eyes as she appraised her newest acquisition. A commotion erupted at the entrance as a tall figure pushed through the crowd. Sarah gasped at the sight of the man's face. The right side was a mass of rippled burn scars, but the left side was hauntingly familiar. James Davis had been her father's law partner years ago, before the courthouse fire that was supposed to have killed him. His steely gaze locked onto William Thompson's hand still gripping Sarah's shoulder. "Take your hands off the lady," James growled, his scarred features twisting into a fearsome snarl. The enforcer sneered and reached for his pistol, but James was faster. In one fluid motion, he drew and fired, the bullet taking Thompson's gun hand clean off at the wrist. Blood sprayed across the green felt tables as chaos erupted through the gambling hall. Catherine Miller's shrill voice cut through the pandemonium, ordering her guards to seize James. But the scarred bounty hunter was already moving, scooping Sarah into his arms and charging for the deck. Bullets splintered the woodwork around them as they burst out into the cool night air. Without hesitation, James leapt over the railing with Sarah, plunging them both into the dark river below. They surfaced downstream, James towing Sarah toward a waiting horse on the riverbank. As he helped her mount, Sarah saw the raw pain in his good eye. "Your father and I were investigating the syndicate's grip on the river courts," he explained grimly. "The fire was meant to destroy our evidence. I survived, but my face and our case went up in flames." "The corruption runs deeper than you know," Sarah said, her wet clothes clinging as she shivered. "My father's been taking bribes to dismiss cases against the syndicate's operations. He's as dirty as the rest now." James's expression hardened as he swung up behind her. "Then we'll expose them all. The syndicates, the corrupt judges, everyone who profits from this river of sin." They rode hard through the night toward Fort Worth, where James had a trusted contact in the U.S. Marshal's office. But Sarah knew the syndicate's reach was long. Already she could hear hoofbeats pursuing them in the darkness. Catherine Miller would not let such valuable collateral slip away easily, and William Thompson would be out for blood after losing his hand. The chase led them south along the river, through territories where the syndicate controlled every sheriff and judge. James pushed their horse to its limits, but their pursuers slowly gained ground. Just before dawn, they were forced to take shelter in an abandoned river mill when their exhausted mount finally gave out. The old wooden structure groaned ominously as the current rushed beneath its rotting foundations. Sarah helped James barricade the doors with rusty machinery while he laid out his remaining ammunition. "We've got maybe 20 rounds," he said grimly. "They'll have 3 times our numbers." She met his gaze steadily. "Then we'll make every shot count." A ghost of a smile crossed his scarred face. "Just like old times in the courthouse. You were always a better shot than your father." The first riders appeared as the sun crested the horizon, led by a one-handed William Thompson whose face was twisted with rage. Catherine Miller rode beside him, her elaborate dress incongruous atop her horse. "Bring me the girl and you can walk away, James," the madam called out. "Or we burn this place down around you. Seems fitting, doesn't it?" Her mocking laugh echoed across the water. James positioned Sarah at a broken window with his spare pistol while he took up position by the door. "When I give the signal, aim for Thompson," he murmured. "He's their muscle. Take him down and the rest might break." Sarah nodded, sighting down the barrel at the enforcer's broad chest. Her hands were steady now, rage replacing fear as she thought of her father's weakness and betrayal. The battle erupted in a deafening exchange of gunfire. Sarah's first shot caught Thompson in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. James's rifle barked steadily, dropping 3 more riders, but there were too many, and soon burning torches arced through the air toward the mill's dry timber walls. As flames began to lick up the sides, Sarah realized the terrible symmetry. James would face fire once again because of her father's sins. Through the thickening smoke, James caught a glimpse of movement along the riverbank. The madam's men were trying to circle behind them. He grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the mill's rear staircase. "The loading dock," he wheezed, his old burn scars tightening in the heat. "There's a skiff tied up down there. If we can reach it—" A burning beam crashed behind them, showering embers across their path. Sarah stumbled on the worn steps but kept her grip on the pistol. The familiar scent of burning wood brought back memories of that night in Fort Worth, when her father first fell into the syndicate's grip. She'd been too young then to understand, But now the pattern was clear. Fire and fear were their weapons of choice, burning away good men's courage until nothing remained but ash and debt. The loading dock creaked ominously beneath their feet as James worked to untie the small boat. Gunfire splintered the wooden posts around them, and Sarah returned fire, her shots forcing their attackers to duck behind cargo crates. The river churned black beneath them, reflecting the orange glow of the burning mill like a mirror to hell itself. "They're coming around both sides," James muttered, finally freeing the rope. "Get in. Stay low." But as Sarah moved toward the skiff, a familiar voice rang out from above. "That's far enough, daughter." Judge William Thompson emerged from the smoke, flanked by 2 gunmen. His once proud bearing was gone, replaced by a haunted desperation. "Father, how could you?" Sarah's voice cracked with fury and grief. "Your own daughter, sold like cattle to cover your debts?" The judge flinched but held his ground. "You don't understand. They own everything now. The courthouse, the marshals, half the territory. There's no fighting them." Behind him, the madam's cruel laugh drifted down. James shifted slightly, positioning himself between Sarah and the gunman. "There's always a choice, William. You taught me that once, before the fire, before you chose wrong." His scarred hands never wavered from his aim. "Sarah, when I move, get to the boat. Don't look back." The judge's eyes widened in recognition as James's words sparked a memory of his former partner. The next moments exploded in chaos. James lunged forward, his first shot taking down the right-hand gunman as Sarah dove for the skiff. The judge hesitated, his own pistol trembling, and in that moment of weakness, the madam's bullet took him in the chest. As William fell, his last shot went wild, striking an oil lamp that burst in a gout of flame. Sarah screamed as her father crumpled, but James was already moving, half dragging her into the boat as fire raced along the dock. They pushed off into the current as the entire mill seemed to erupt, timbers groaning and collapsing in a storm of sparks. Through the inferno, they glimpsed the madam and her remaining men fleeing on horseback towards Silver City. The river carried them swiftly away from the burning mill, but Sarah's sobs cut through the roar of the flames. James guided the skiff with one hand while keeping his rifle ready. "Your father made his choice," he said quietly. "But he gave us a chance at the end. The hesitation was his gift to you." Sarah wiped her eyes, grief hardening into resolution. "Then we'll use it. The syndicate's reach ends here." As dawn broke over the river, they made plans. The judge's private papers, safely hidden in James's saddlebags, would expose the entire corrupt network, judges, marshals, and the silent partners growing rich off human misery. The evidence would burn brighter than any fire, and this time, the cleansing flames would consume the guilty rather than the innocent. They beached the skiff near a friendly trading post outside Abilene, where James had cached fresh horses and supplies. As they mounted up, Sarah looked back at the thin column of smoke still rising from the mill. "What happens when we reach Tombstone?" she asked. James adjusted his hat, hiding the worst of his scars. "Justice," he replied simply. "The real kind this time." They rode out together as the sun climbed higher, leaving the river and its dark memories behind. The journey to Tombstone took them through harsh country, each mile revealing more of the syndicate's reach. In every settlement, James and Sarah found traces. Saloons that doubled as trafficking hubs, corrupt lawmen turning blind eyes, and honest folk too terrified to speak. But they also discovered allies, quiet networks of people who'd lost loved ones to the organization's web. A shopkeeper in Silver City slipped them detailed ledgers. A widow in Fort Worth provided names of witnesses willing to testify. The scarred landscape seemed to mirror James's own face, and Sarah found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. She saw now how he'd survived that fire. Not just physically, but in his soul. The flames that should have destroyed him had instead forged something unbreakable. In his careful planning and quiet determination, she recognized the brilliant legal mind that had once partnered with her father, before greed and desperation had torn their world apart. They arrived in Tombstone as autumn winds began to sweep the streets. The evening sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps in Fort Worth as Jake Thompson emerged from his hiding place in the shadows of a nearby alley. His scarred face caught the fading light as he watched William Davis, the corrupt judge who had once been his partner, being led away in chains. The satisfaction of finally bringing Davis to justice mingled with the bitterness of lost years and broken trust. Sarah Davis stood beside Jake, her fingers intertwined with his as they witnessed her father's arrest. The past month had transformed her from a judge's sheltered daughter into a woman who understood the true meaning of survival. The bruises from her time in Mary Wilson's brothel were fading, but the memories would take longer to heal. She squeezed Jake's hand, drawing strength from the man who had risked everything to save her. Thomas Miller, the federal marshal who had helped Jake expose the criminal enterprise, approached them with purposeful strides. "The syndicate's books tell quite a story," he said, his voice gravelly from years of tobacco. "Judge Davis's gambling debts were just the beginning. We've uncovered corruption reaching all the way to Silver City and beyond. The river trade routes were their lifeline, moving everything from stolen cattle to Chinese girls. The crowd gathering around the courthouse grew as word spread through Fort Worth. Jake spotted familiar faces among them. Elizabeth Thompson, his sister who had nursed him back to health after the fire, and James Wilson, the newspaper editor who had helped piece together the evidence. Even Samuel Johnson, the reluctant informant who had first told Jake about Sarah's whereabouts, lurked at the edges of the crowd. "You were right about Catherine Miller," Sarah said softly, referring to the syndicate's bookkeeper who had turned state's evidence. "She kept records of everything. Every bribe, every transaction, every girl they sold. Even the order my father signed to have you killed in that fire." Jake's burns seemed to tighten at the memory, but he pushed the sensation aside. The past was finally being laid to rest. The riverboats continued their endless journey along the Trinity River, but the criminal empire that had once controlled these waters was crumbling. Jake had spent 3 years building his case, tracking every connection between corrupt lawmen and the brothel owners who served as their fronts. The syndicate had grown complacent, never suspecting that the disfigured bounty hunter pursuing their lower-ranking members was systematically dismantling their organization. Mary Wilson's defiant screams echoed from inside the jail as deputies led her past barred windows. The madam had maintained her innocence to the end, even as mounting evidence revealed her role in trafficking young women from struggling families. Sarah shuddered, remembering the gilt-edged horror of Mary's establishment, where desperate fathers' debts were paid in their daughter's flesh. "The governor's office is sending investigators," Thomas announced, consulting a telegram. "They'll be interviewing everyone connected to Davis's court. 3 judges in Abilene have already resigned, and there's panic in Tombstone's legal circles." He smiled grimly. "Like cutting the head off a snake. The whole body's thrashing." Jake nodded, knowing the ripples would spread for months to come. Emma Johnson, Samuel's wife who had helped shelter Sarah after her escape, brought them cups of coffee as the sky darkened. The autumn air carried a chill, but none of them were ready to leave. After so many years of shadows and secrets, they needed to witness every moment of justice being served. The courthouse lights blazed as clerks worked late into the night, documenting the extent of the corruption. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. Jake studied her profile in the lamplight, seeing echoes of the spirited young woman he'd known before everything changed. "We rebuild," he said simply. "Your father's crimes don't define you, and this town is more than the corruption that infected it. There are good people here who want justice." Elizabeth approached with a leather satchel containing the last of the evidence: letters, ledgers, and photographs that had finally exposed the truth. "The U.S. Attorney's Office is sending prosecutors," she reported. "They're talking about making this a test case for federal anti-trafficking laws." The scope of what they had uncovered was still expanding, reaching into territories and jurisdictions far beyond Fort Worth. As night settled over the town, Jake and Sarah walked along the river where it all began. The water reflected the stars, its surface deceptively peaceful. "I remember when you first came to work with my father," Sarah said. "You believed in the law then?" Jake touched the scars that had become his mask. "I still do," he replied. "That's why I had to fight for it. Real justice doesn't hide in the shadows." The next morning brought reporters from as far as Chicago, drawn by rumors of the scandal. James Wilson's newspaper office was besieged by telegrams requesting details. But Jake and Sarah were already gone, riding west toward Silver City where more of the syndicate's operations waited to be exposed. The law had been corrupted, but they would restore it, one town at a time. Behind them, Fort Worth began its slow healing. like skin growing over old burns, stronger for having survived the fire. The journey to Silver City proved harder than expected, with Jake and Sarah forced to take winding routes through canyon country to avoid the syndicate's scouts. They stopped at small trading posts along the river, gathering intelligence from merchants who whispered about strange shipments and armed men controlling the waterways. Sarah's legal training helped her piece together the fragments of information, revealing a network that stretched from Fort Worth to the Mexican border. During a stormy evening at a remote way station, Sarah discovered letters in Jake's saddlebag, correspondence between him and her father from before the fire. The pages revealed how deeply Samuel had been trapped by the syndicate, not just through gambling debts but through threats against his family. Jake had been investigating them even then, working in secret to protect both father and daughter. The revelation brought tears to Sarah's eyes, understanding at last the weight of loyalty that had shaped both men's choices. In Silver City, they found James Wilson's newspaper contacts had prepared the ground. Elizabeth, a former brothel worker turned informant, provided crucial documentation about the syndicate's operations. The gang had expanded beyond prostitution into controlling river trade routes, forcing legitimate merchants to pay protection money or risk having their shipments lost in transit. Their reach extended to every level of law enforcement, from local sheriffs to territorial marshals. Working methodically, Jake and Sarah built their case. They tracked money trails through bank records, documented witness statements, and mapped the syndicate's hierarchy. Sarah's legal expertise proved invaluable, ensuring their evidence would stand up in court. Jake's reputation as the scarred bounty hunter opened doors that would have remained closed to official investigators. Together, they were dismantling the criminal empire piece by piece. The syndicate retaliated with increasing desperation. 3 attempts were made on their lives in 2 weeks. During one attack, Sarah proved her mettle by shooting 2 assailants while Jake was pinned down. The burns that had once marked him as an outcast now became a symbol of their shared mission. The visible cost of standing against corruption. Their partnership deepened into something more, though neither spoke of it directly. The final confrontation came at an abandoned riverport outside Silver City. The syndicate's leaders had gathered to plan their counterattack, not expecting Jake and Sarah to have already positioned a force of honest lawmen from 3 territories. The ensuing battle lasted through the night, with the river itself seeming to roar its approval as justice was finally served. When dawn broke, the syndicate's reign was over. In the aftermath, Sarah established a legal practice dedicated to defending those who had been victimized by corruption. Jake continued his work as a bounty hunter, but now focused on bringing down similar criminal organizations across the territories. They maintained their partnership, meeting regularly to share information and support each other's missions. The scars of the past remained, but they had been transformed into badges of honor. Years later, when asked about those events, the people of Silver City would speak of how a scarred man and a judge's daughter had restored faith in the law. The river trade routes flourished again, free from criminal control. Samuel's name was cleared posthumously, his final letters revealing his desperate attempts to protect his daughter while working against the syndicate from within. The truth had finally emerged, like gold washed clean in the river's flow. The story spread beyond the territories, carried by newspaper accounts and travelers' tales. It became a testament to the power of justice over corruption, of healing over hurt. Jake and Sarah's legacy lived on in the changes they had wrought. In new laws protecting women, in stricter oversight of law enforcement, and in the enduring belief that one person's stand against evil could inspire others to follow. The river continued its eternal journey, but now it carried hope instead of darkness. As winter approached, Jake and Sarah stood once again by moving waters, this time near Silver City. The scars on his face had faded somewhat, but the determination in both their eyes remained unchanged. They had more work to do, more battles to fight, but they would face them together. The law had been restored, not just in courtrooms and jailhouses, but in the hearts of those who had witnessed their journey from Fort Worth to Silver City, from vengeance to justice, from loss to redemption.